All right. Recording in progress. Behave yourself. So what we have seen, and what we're seeing, I think, just to look at the kind of overarching big picture of Scripture, I think can be summarized as the story of creation, fall through disobedience, and then restoration. You know, ever since that fall, that humanity that occurred with humanity and with all creation in the beginning. Now we're on a journey towards God restoring creation to its perfection, which we Christians would describe as the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. That's what we're aiming towards. The story, in a sense, climaxes. It does not end, but it reaches its culminating point with the birth, death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ. So we're going to begin next week studying that story of Jesus. So that's what we still have ahead of us. Where we've been, we had chapter 1. God saw that it was good. This is the story of creation and the story of the fall. So we've, in a very short period of time, we've set the stage for the story of our salvation history. God created a perfect world, and through human disobedience, we fell away and became separated from God. And so that is sort of chapter 1. Now, as we begin that process of trying to restore creation to its perfection, we see that in chapter 2 of the path, with the story of Noah. God says, all right, let's start over again. So he basically does that, wipes the slate almost clean, starts over again. Doesn't really turn out any better than it did the first time, but that was the first effort. And then chapter 3, the ancestor of a multitude. We've got Bob Link who covered that chapter. You want to summarize that for us?
What I want to do, I hope it's a summary. This is chapter 3 in the Path book, and it's titled The Ancestor of the Multitudes. And I like to think of it as the story of Abraham and Sarah. The story is taken from our Bible, Genesis chapters 12 through 24. And according to my timeline, the story takes place 4,000 years ago, which is a long time for sure. And it was a couple of centuries before Joseph and 6 centuries before Moses. And like I said, it's a long time. Maybe 4 millennium, maybe not, but a lot. The major characters are God, Abraham, Sarah, Hagar, Ishmael, Isaac, and Rebekah. And the major events, I just listed what they are. God asking Abram to move his people from Haran to the land of Canaan. And Abraham and Sarah had no children. And with Sarah's blessing, Abraham had a son. They had a son, Ishmael, by a slave, Hagar. And then God made a covenant with Abraham, and I think this is the key part of this story. He renamed them Abraham and Sarah. And in the covenant, he said, "You shall be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you." And then in addition to that, you got Abraham bargaining with God for Sodom, the birth of Isaac, the banishment of Hagar and Ishmael, the potential sacrifice of Isaac, and obtaining Rebekah as a wife for Isaac. So how did God's covenant work out? What major religions today are considered Abrahamic religions? That's a question for the audience. Give me one. What?
Islam.
Islam. What's this, another one?
Judaism.
What's another one? Christianity, Tad Bundy. So there's if you Google it up on the world's population in 2010, there's like almost 7 billion people on earth. What percent of those do you think are Abrahamic related? Give me somebody throw out a number.
4 billion.
What?
4 billion.
4 out of 6?
4 billion.
4 billion out of 6?
Yeah.
Well, you're in the neighborhood. Anybody else?
A little less.
Yeah, about 53% or 54%. And that's a bunch. If you were a baseball player and you hit that percentage, you would be batting 500, which would be you'd be very, very successful.
Is that percentage by self-identification?
It's by some census that they did in 2010. I don't. Yeah. So what is the single most dominant characteristic that is common to the 3 Abrahamic religions? Absolutely. That's true.
Good job. Yes, monotheism, if you pointed out, is a relatively new idea in terms of really for most of human history, worship multiple gods. I think monotheism was largely something that the Greeks had. So you can see that Hellenistic influence in a lot of these beliefs in monotheism. This is also God's next strategy to try to redeem creation, right? Picks Abraham and says, I'm going to bless you, and through you, all the peoples of the earth will be blessed. So God's not blessing Abraham's sake, but for the sake of all creation. So then we've got Joseph had a dream, chapter 4. This is not a pretty picture of human behavior. You may remember that one of the first acts of violence in the Bible, maybe the first, is Cain murdering his brother Abel. Brothers seem to not get along very well a lot of the time. Here we've got brothers behaving badly towards one another. I think that one of the important themes that we see in this chapter is that God is revealed as a God of providence, a God who provides. So you've got this great drought and famine come upon the land that could have killed thousands and thousands of people, but God was able, through God's actions, to provide for all those people. They didn't starve to death. Chapter 5, I am who I am.
Dave.
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, can I interrupt? Pam, I can't see very well, but I think Pam, do you want to add anything to that?
Thank you. Actually, to add a little more to that, there's a set of stories about 2 sets of brothers, and like you said, brothers in the Bible, like along. And Jacob and Esau are the beginning of the story, and their twins. Rebecca and Isaac have each a favorite, which creates problems, and then later on down the line, Jacob steals Esau's birthright, steals the blessing of his father, and then goes away because it creates problems in the family, and he goes to live with Laban. And he falls in love with one of his daughters. It was he falls in love with Rachel, but Laban tricks him and he says, well, I have this older daughter, Celia, so you need to marry her first and then you can marry Rachel. And so over a 14-year period, he works for Laban and marries both women. Later on, Jacob and Esau reconcile, so there is that, as you said. And Jacob has 12 sons, and again, there's a favorite. And we all know the story of Julia's favorite, he's Joseph. Joseph is betrayed by his brothers, sent off to Egypt. He becomes the leader in the Pharaoh's echelon, and he comes to power as a dream. and dreams of famine, saves Egypt with his dream by storing away all the grains and things, and he also saves his family. And in the process, there is another reconciliation with his family.
Okay, great, thank you.
So there's a point there, the guy reading that story that struck me that I hadn't paid any attention to. But the people that they sold him off to were Egyptians, right?
Yes.
And they had another name.
Ishmael.
Where do you think that came from? Okay, so that was Ishmael's descendants.
Yeah.
And his mother had been was an Egyptian, I think. And so it's interesting that the Ishmaelites were involved again. That's a couple of centuries later.
Great, thank you very much. And it's Ishmael, through whom the Muslims trace their own genealogy rather than through Isaac, yeah. So thank you. I'm going off of maybe an old dated script that Claire gave me. So if somebody else is assigned to cover something, just interrupt me and let me know. I'll try to pass. I will also note that what Claire wrote for me said to summarize each chapter in a sentence or two. I took her literally at that. But we are not, we have plenty of time, so you do not need to rush. So just, we can relax and take as much time to cover each chapter as we need to.
So having been in EFM for years, we know that when someone says 2 or 3 sentences, it's just an idea.
It's a guideline.
I guess I'm just a literalist.
No,
And you feel free to chime in too.
Okay. I'm enjoying this. Thank you.
Rod,
So, we're at Exodus on, a lot of familiar stories in here. I think the Jewish people, next to the creation story, the book of Exodus is the most important book in the Old Testament. This establishes a unified identity. And previously they were like, even in Egypt, there were 12 tribes. They were connected. They weren't really connected other than their mutual slavery situation. So God calls Moses the burning bush, and this is where we hear I am who I am, which is Yahweh. This is the first time we hear this. God's what he wants to be called. He gives Moses a mission to go to people because God remembered them. Very important indeed. He remembered them and they applied in the latest phrase. So Moses goes down and he tries to lobby with the Pharaoh. That doesn't work. He sends the 10 plagues. And we often focus on the impact of the 10 plagues on the Pharaoh and the Egyptians. But I think he was sending a strong message to the Israelites that he was more powerful than the Pharaoh and the Egyptians in order to get them to open their eyes and listen to what he was doing for them. So I think, like I said, there was 2 audiences there, and sometimes we don't think so much about the impact that might have had on the Israelites. Since he took 10 plagues, Pharaoh lets them go. They have the Red Sea incidents, and then they began their trek to Mount Horeb. And there's several, up to maybe 1 million people moving. But from Exodus, we get the 10 Commandments. I forgot to mention that we get Passover, which is how they were able to read it. We start to see the structure of the Israelites coming under kind of one leadership. Judges are appointed. There's organization, and we see the temple the temple is organized as a place to worship, which God gives a very detailed description of how the temple will be set up, how people will be worshiped, and how that whole process will work. And that structure of the temple and the way that it's set up continues to this day. And most of it has carried over into our own religion, to our own Christian religion. Way also the celebration of Passover, the way that our sanctuary is set up has a lot of same characteristics. So God has given them, and again, He makes a new covenant. Give you this land if you follow, if you commit to following it. Of course, they don't. We have several dramatic events where they have to get that sorted out. But it's amazing how powerful influence this story has on a whole religious outlook, both Christian as well as Jewish. And as we well know, Moses appears in the New Testament frequently, most significantly at the Transfiguration. Jesus is there. So that's it. Moses is in Exodus in 2 sentences.
That's great. Can I add one connection that I love, and that's important to note? Rod said, in the burning bush is the episode where Moses encounters God in the burning bush is where we learn the name of God. I am who I am, or and so that really resonates in the Gospels when Jesus says things like, I am the bread of life. I am the living water. Those are clues for us to know that of Jesus' divine identity. So.
Correct. Yes, and we'll see that especially in the Gospel of John. So
And when the temple was established, then the priesthood was also established, and that role of the priest. And the role of priest continues to, we see that over and over again.
They're given specific, the Levites were given these other specific responsibilities.
But they had a specific role.
So that was chapter 5 and kind of went into chapter 6 a little bit also, which includes kind of the deliverance through the Red Sea. We're going to hear that in church this morning. One of the things that I think that we're seeing as this Exodus story unfolds, I describe God as we saw him in Genesis, often as a God of providence, a God who provides. Now we're seeing God as God the Almighty, the God who delivers through strength and through power and through the overcoming of enemies who far outnumbered what they were. So that's a pattern that we're going to start to see in the Bible. And then chapter 7, we're starting to move back into the promised land. Kim, are you going to summarize that for us?
Well, I take Claire literally, so I have some sympathy.
Oh.
It's a good expounding, buddy. So I was just gonna read this, of course, when the walls of Jericho fall. I find it curious that again, it's actually gospel or reading it this morning, another time where water is separated. Now it's the Jordan River, and I'm leading the people, Josh is leading the people into another promised land. Finally.
And it's important, I think, in this story to point out that we have historically understood this as a story of God's promise being kept to the people of Israel, a story of deliverance and freedom. More and more work is being done now with the perspective of Native American people in the United States, and they see this story as a story of dispossession and occupation. So a lot depends on what our perspective is, how we read it, because a Native American person is going to relate to the Canaanites who are just hanging out, minding their own business And along come these people that slaughter them and take their land.
Let's say God told me to.
Yeah. So I think we also always have to be careful about what we think God is telling us to do.
Didn't God give Abraham Canaan?
He said to your ancestors, I will give this land. Yeah.
No, but he sent him from Haran to Canaan and said, this will be your land.
Mhm.
So if you want to go, keep going back, you know.
No, I agree. And that this is the traditional reading of this story.
Sure.
But I'm just saying that, you know, different people are gonna read it a little different on their history and their perspective. All right. Chapter 8, the Lord raised up judges. Did anybody have this? This is, you know, the story. What we're seeing here repeated over and over again. And we've already seen it in the Old Testament, but in the story of the stories told in Judges, we're going to see this pattern over and over and over again. The people of Israel sinning, God's judgment against them, God punishes them, they repent, they're forgiven, they sin. They're like that over and over and over again. And, you know, one of the things that I like to say about this pattern is that one of the things that I admire about the Jewish people is that the story they tell about themselves is a story of failure, the ways in which they've fallen short, and the ways in which God has forgiven over and over and over again. And so I think that this is a story that we all should, on some level, internalize because we're living it ourselves. Each of us individually is constantly sinning, being judged, repenting, being forgiven, and all over again. So I think that this is a pattern that should give us humility about who we are. Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.
Dave,
Now,
sorry.
yes.
Dave, sorry, can I interrupt? Guess what I forgot? I forgot my own assignment. I forgot like which I just completely, so that was one of the chapters I had, and Dave, you did an awesome job of that.
Oh,
The only thing I'd want to add is I just want to feature a couple of the women that we learned about in that chapter, and one of them was Deborah. She may have been the first judge, I can't remember, but at any rate, I think it was Deborah who it's one of the women, but I'm pretty sure it's Deborah who's, you know, kind of speaking in kind of poetic language here. But what's so about the victory, you know, kind of getting the land and over these people, but in her song, she has these very poignant lines that recognize the great grief that especially the mother of a slain, you know, Canaanite king is feeling. So what I love about this is this awareness that this victory comes at a cost, and I love that she recognizes that grief. Then the other person I wanted to point out, which y'all will remember, is Miriam, Moses' sister, who, and this may have been in one of your chapters, Rod, I can't remember. Anyway, you can tell I've had COVID, and my copy of the Path with all the notes in is at the office. But Miriam sings this wonderful song, and you may have even said this, Rod, so I apologize if I'm repeating this, but she sings this wonderful song of deliverance and leads everyone in this song and dance. And her song is is one of, if not the oldest piece that we have in the Bible. So that's just kind of awesome. So
It's Exodus 15.
what's that?
Exodus 15.
Okay. Yeah.
thank you. Thank you.
And that's a great point about the women, about Deborah, and the compassion for those who've been defeated. You know, there's a kind of a rabbinic story. You know, the rabbis have a tradition commenting on scripture. And going back to the story of the deliverance through the Red Sea, there's a rabbinic story that the heavenly hosts were, when the people of Egypt were drowned in the Red Sea, the heavenly hosts were celebrating over at this victory. And they were gathered around God, celebrating, and God silenced them and said, the Egyptians who are drowning in the Red Sea are also my children. And so, again, I think that's just an interesting, different perspective on the story.
Hey, the quick about judges, you were talking about judges. My sense is that those weren't judges like people that adjudicated law,
Correct.
but that they were judges like our county commission of judges, county judges, more administrative, organizationally. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of chieftains. I mean, this is a,
Okay.
but there was no, there was no official designation. I don't think that, this is what you have to do in order to be a judge. They were local leaders. All right, where are we? I have no idea. Chapter 9, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. This is going to be the end of the story of the judges. We're going to talk about Samuel, who is the final judge, and the beginning of the era of kings for the people of Israel. So this is another important turning point. We're setting the stage for King David. And, we have part of the pattern of the people of Israel and of our story as well. The people being set aside to be something, to be different from the people of the world, and the people of Israel are going to say, no, we just want to be like everybody else. And so God warns them what's going to happen when they raise up a king, and they want the king anyway. And guess what happened? Exactly what God had warned them about. So once again, things aren't going to go all that well. That's kind of chapter 10 and 11. And I mean, chapter 9 and 10. Chapter 11, the Parmeters, I believe, are going to summarize.
Yep. Chapter 11, David, about 5'3", kills Goliath, which is said to be 300 cubits, which was 9 feet, 9 inches. That's quite a difference. Tension between David and Saul increases, and Saul tries to kill David on multiple occasions. Saul and his children are killed in a terrible battle with the Philistines. After a long war, David becomes king, and Israel was united with the capital in Jerusalem. David brings the ark to Jerusalem. God makes a covenant with David. Some of the points: rest from his enemies, makes David a house. His son will build a house for God's name, establish his throne forever. Then there's, after all that, after the covenant is done, and David commits adultery with Bathsheba and has Uriah killed, and the resulting child dies. Nathan condemns David, and now he has a curse: the sword shall never depart from his house, and a neighbor shall lie with his wives openly for others to see.
Great.
We
Yeah.
can tell that God doesn't require us to be perfect to be God's agent, right? Or God's people who carry out God's vocation.
David's still a God after a man after God's own heart.
As deeply flawed as he is.
Yeah, deeply flawed. So it does help me feel better sometimes.
Even more so when your name's David.
Yeah.
And I can't remember if this was featured in our book, but just thinking about the phrase "a man after God's own heart," I've always thought from reading this, but I can't remember if it features in the path, that perhaps one of the reasons he was someone after God's own heart is he was pretty good at repenting, right? Recognizing his sin and turning around. I mean, he kept repeating it over and over, but I don't know. Do you have any particular thoughts about why it is that David is a man after God's own heart? Because y'all spent a lot of time and attention on that.
I think it was just his faithfulness. That, even at the very beginning of that, in the story with Goliath, that here all these warriors are quaking in their boots and he's like, what? You've got God on your side, and that faithfulness is echoed over and over and over again as he, and again, I think that's part of the repentance. Is that he's able to hold on to that relationship with God.
And I think he loved God.
Yeah.
And you see that in the Psalms and in his obedience to not killing Saul. He respected God, he reverenced God, he loved God, but he was still human with flaws that we all had. He made a good effort. Yeah.
Well, y'all are much kinder to David than I.
I agree with you.
I agree.
Yeah, he was quite the same.
He was cute, but.
What he did with Bathsheba's husband was, beyond
Was an adulterer and a murderer.
Yeah.
So anyways,
And he paid for that. God didn't just not do anything. I mean,
well, God killed his kid. I mean, what kind of,
and didn't
What
take
kind of
into his
punishment is that?
war, and disgraced him with his women, other people, openly having, relations with his wives. I mean, he did embarrass them and he really, he did a job on them after, he did have to pay for that. He didn't get off scot-free.
yeah, it seems to me that people around him suffered as much as he did.
Yeah.
But again, this is a great example of how there are so many ways to read this stuff. And I've really come to think of David as a monster. Yeah, that's just me.
Now that makes it even harder.
I hear you, buddy. So anyways, that's an interesting thing. And,
So maybe that's why you named your son Samuel and not David.
he came to us with that,
Okay.
but I think it's a better name, Samuel.
I love David.
And I think that both perspectives are true. It's not necessarily either.
I really appreciate that point, David. David Scano, that both perspectives are true. I think we need to remember that a lot with the Bible. We have to hold so much that's contradictory together, and the Lord works through all of it.
All right, that brings us back to Kim on chapter 12.
So this is Solomon. And that's the wisdom of God be within him. Builds the first temple. With what people should worship. Queen of Sheba comes to visit him. Learning of his wisdom at the time. And this is kind of a side note, the Song of Solomon is in reference to Solomon. Remember, he likes lots of women as well. And I love this book. Reverend Claire has this book, Bible Women. And it was just curious to me that in this Song of Solomon, the Shulamite woman, this author is purported that the Song of Solomon was written primarily by this woman. She says that there's no man who can follow the words of the love and the passion and write it down, say it. The beautiful, sensual, provocative, elegant, loyal words, and to the tune of about 1,425 words. And she gives good reason why she thinks the Shulamite woman actually wrote the Song of Solomon.
It doesn't say who she was, her name.
It just her. No, it doesn't. She just loves a shepherd. She's a young woman in love with a shepherd, and so she's brought to King Solomon, and becomes part of his harem. and she misses the shepherd. So she writes a song. And she misses him and loves him. So I just thought I'd give you something that you wanted.
Nice. 18. Chapter 13, here I am, send me. As a brief, yes. Oh, okay, awesome.
So, 13 is about three prophets, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah. Elijah was called by God. He noted that he is the first person that he raises someone from the dead. Elijah takes on the Israelites have fallen under the power of Baal again. So he has this battle with all of the Baal priests about killing the bulls and sacrificing, which he prevails. And he tries to get people to come back to their true God. He's run out of town by Jezebel, who is jealous of him and wants to kill him. He goes to Mount Horeb, and here he experiences God, because God tells him he will pass by him, but he can't. He says he hears from him and the storm, and then he hears the sound of silence. And God passes by. I always thought that was cool. God was there in the sound of silence. I think that's a key message for all of us.
Because God is hardly ever silent.
Excuse me.
Because God is hardly ever silent.
Well, sometimes he's there in silence if we don't hear it, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And then Elijah is taken up in the whirlwind, and he passes his work to Elisha. Then we have Isaiah, and Isaiah is called, and the first thing that he has to do is be purified by the holiness time. He says, "Here I am to serve you." Then one of my favorite verses is 10:6, where he says, they have eyes, but they can't see, and they have ears, but they can't hear. And you see this repeated over and over and over. Subsequently, included by Jesus in the New Testament. So Isaiah is prophesizing, he's trying to get people to turn back. He's telling them if they don't turn back, they're going to be taken over. And he makes a lot of prophecies which ultimately are fulfilled. But a very significant prophet. Then you have Jeremiah says, the Lord called him, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you, and I appointed you to be prophet for the nations. And Jeremiah again is the same thing. You must repent, and you must turn back to God. And of course, they don't want to do that. And then Jeremiah puts a lot of emphasis on the fact that you're going to be destroyed, and Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, but there will be a remnant. So this remnant is a thing that continues on there. It's just something that was promulgated by Jeremiah.
Great. And we have covered chronologically now, really the last days of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, their fall and destruction, and people of Judea being carried off to Babylon. So that's going to occur sort of during this time period. And there are a lot more prophets as well. They just picked these three for whatever reason. Two of them are considered two of the major prophets, the other one being Ezekiel. Anyways, the prophets are always fun to read. They're very cranky, and they speak the truth and they tend to get into a lot of trouble as a result. That's what usually happens. Claire, anything to add to that?
No, this is great. Thank you very much. Y'all are, it's so fascinating to hear your summaries.
And Louise, next chapter.
Have Daniel on the line still. And the chapter spends a lot of time at the beginning explaining who Daniel is, what family is, how he gets in that lion's den to begin with. But basically, the book helps you recognize how the story of Daniel is a story of power and authority and strength of God, as well as the faithfulness of one man. The chapter also discusses the prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel, and it outlines their visions for the people and they gave the people hope, how they gave people hope and assurance, and that in spite of their sin, God would be faithful to them, promising when the time was ready, he would send a deliverer. That's basically what the chapter says. 5 sentences.
Excellent.
Unbelievable.
Anything else on the story of Daniel? Wilson has the next chapter.
This is go up and rebuild. There's 2 stories in here. It's about the rebuilding of the Babylonian exile and the rebuilding of the temple. And then it ends with the story of Esther. So, and I love that bookend at the end with the story. We pick up Rod's where Jeremiah left off, just picks it up. And we're in about 598. Nebuchadnezzar and the defeat of Jerusalem. People are hauled off to Babylon. Jerusalem is totally destroyed, wiped out. This will happen. This is a pattern that's going to happen over and over and over again. But probably the best way, I love the Psalms, and you get these summary stories. So Psalm 137 does it best for me, and it says, by the waters of Babylon, we sat down and wept when we remembered you, O Zion. As for our harps, we hung them up on trees in the midst of that land. For those who led us away captive asked us for a song, and our oppressors called for mirth. Sing us one of your songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song upon this alien soil? It goes on about the heartbreak and who are we? Our temple's gone, that hauled us off. But Jeremiah told them something. He said, use this to your advantage. Something good will come out of this. And they do. They finally said, who are we? Because it's basically an oral tradition. They decided to write the stories down, and they put a lot of this on paper. And then you have the story of, I love this rainbow of the art all the way from what Bob said with Abraham. It's this big rainbow of back and forth across the Mesopotamia and into down to Jerusalem and then back and back. And the idea of a rainbow, there's hope at the end of the rainbow, and I sort of read that into the history. But I love the fact that they hauled off the loot from the temple. And yet, these people are really good bookkeepers. And being an old auditor and an inventory, I just love this because it says, when Cyrus told them they could go home and rebuild the temple, and that's one of the most phenomenal events in history, and it's a real person. I mean, you have documented proof that this man really existed, and it said, moreover, this is in Ezra chapter 1, verse 7. Moreover, King Cyrus brought out the articles belonging to the temple of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had carried away from Jerusalem and had them placed in the temple of his God. Cyrus, king of Persia, had them brought out the treasure, and here was the inventory: 30 gold dishes, 1,000 silver dishes, 29 silver pans, gold bowls,
matching silver bowls and 1,000 other articles. All total, there was 5,400 articles of gold and silver that he sent home with. To me, I just love that story. I love the bookkeeping. But then what happens is you have Ezra, and he was the best biblical scholar, and he pulled all this together. And when they dedicated this process, took 30, 40 years to rebuild the temple. It didn't happen overnight, but he pulls them all in and reestablishes Passover, reestablishes and tells them these stories that they collected, and it's a new beginning. That's the great thing about the story. It's just, here we are, we come out of the wilderness, we wandered through this desert, we're back, and here we're going to start again. So it's a very, very powerful story, and I think that idea of the Babylonian captivity can come up over and over and over again. It's a very pertinent metaphor. But then I love this last story. It's about good and evil and the women. And the thing I love about the past is it takes these wonderful story of these very important women throughout this whole story. And it starts with Abraham and Sarah and Hagar. Then it takes the story of Hannah, which is Samuel's mother, just an extraordinary story, and Rahab the prostitute. Then you have Naomi and Ruth, and then you end with the story of Esther. And it's good and evil, but at the end, as this is overcome and it all works itself out, what do? They have a party. They celebrate the Feast of Purim, and it's the Jewish version of Mardi Gras. And they get drunk and they yell and they scream and they put Purim down. I said, what a wonderful way to end the story in the past on one great big party.
Great. So now we've come to the end, of course, of the Hebrew Bible that we call the Old Testament. We're entering an important period historically in terms of the ways that the scriptures wound up being written down. Many of these stories are very, very old, but they were being handed down orally. Probably they started to become written down in something resembling the current form that we have them during what is known as the Second Temple period of Judaism. That is the period following the rebuilding of the temple at Jerusalem. And so one of the key questions that people are asking themselves as they return to this ruined city and this ruined temple to rebuild everything is, if we're God's chosen people, then why has this happened to us? And the answer is going to be because we were unfaithful. God made covenants with us. We screwed up, and so God punished us. And so that is an important theme that you see repeated over and over again throughout the Old Testament, which very much reflects the concerns of the people who were sort of redacting these stories during the Second Temple period.
So one idea is that had there not been God involved in that the Jewish traditions down through the years would have never survived. So, I mean, with all the things they went through and all this, that, and the other, and God was always a continuing force in that. Otherwise, they probably would have, at some point in time, either during the Babylonian deal or on back, would have been no more. I think the point about what you're saying about going from oral to written tradition is real important. And that happened about 400 or 500 BC. I was recently talking to my neighbor yesterday, and he's, I don't know if he's an atheist, whatever, but he's reading the Bible. And he said he was amazed when he finally got to a real person, real identifiable person to him, Cyrus. Okay, and that's because it was written history at that point, supported by other written history. Yeah. But Cyrus is a hero in the story. Mm-hmm.
He's literally a Messiah in the story. God's anointed. Mm-hmm.
He is described as being anointed by God, and the Hebrew word for anointed one is Messiah. The Greek word is Christ. So he is described in messianic terms.
So God's agents aren't limited to, the people that we think of necessarily as God's people.
It's also one of the themes that's also believed to have come out of this time period is that while the people of Judah were in captivity in Babylon, it became important to them to maintain their own identity because they'd been taken away from their land. And so the leaders are trying to tell the people, hang on to our identity. Don't become like the people who are holding us captive. And so that theme of separation and of them being a people set apart is another thing that you're going to see over and over again in the Old Testament. And that is probably a reflection of some of those concerns that came out of the time of the Babylonian exile.
They're all bad. The next step.
Yeah, we're moving finally into the New Testament.
Yeah, so I just want to start with thanking you all for your prayers, because I've been gone for about 4 months now. I drove with my 2 dachshund puppies to Wyoming, pulling my camper, where I stayed and worked as a campground attendant in Cultivate Village in the Grand Teton National Park. And it's a lovely experience, but it's great to be back. And thanks to Claire also for her prayers. As I was driving back on a 2-lane road, I looked up and there was a motorcycle coming right at me. And just by the grace of God and his mighty angels, he got back into his lane. So, I mean, it's every day that God's presence is with us, and how great it is that we can support each other in prayer, and what power there is in that undertaking to lift each other up. So thanks y'all for that. And just going on to this wonderful chapter, I pretty much just kind of came up with my own summary, and that God basically wants us to live in peace and joy, and it is his gift to us, and we are not to be troubled or fearful. And in the book of John, he says, let not your heart be troubled, and do not be afraid. And in John 14, and in John 10:10, the devil comes to steal, kill, and destroy. But God says, Jesus says, I came that you may have life and have it more abundantly. So I just think when we think of the good news of great joy in the birth of Christ, in the summary, that it is such a beautiful gift of joy. And how the angels are also, they're Gabriel, and the angel that meets the shepherds. And then what is he telling them? Do not. So it's just continuing that walk of faith that I think we're encouraged to live out. That's my 2 sentences.
Awesome. Thank you. And welcome back. It's great
Yeah,
to be back.
thanks, y'all.
And you've got just a couple of minutes left. So let me take up a little bit of time. Claire may need some as well. We are going to be jumping back in next week with Follow Me, I believe is the name of the chapter. I think we talked a little bit about this in the spring, but I want to remind you again that this book, and this is the only thing about this book that really made both Claire and me a little bit anxious, is that it homogenizes the 4 Gospels into one single account. And that's an interesting way to read the Gospels. It's problematic in many ways because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are very, very different Gospels with very different perspectives and very different concerns. And so please keep that in mind as you read through these Gospel accounts. Most of you know, I think, that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptics because they do have a great deal in common with one another. You're probably familiar with the 2 source hypothesis in terms of how the synoptics were written, that Mark was probably the earliest of the synoptics written. There was another gospel source that we call Q, that was just a sayings, a collection of Jesus sayings, probably. Mark and Q probably didn't know each other. Their stories seem to have been different. Matthew and Luke each had access to Mark and Q. So you can see Luke and Matthew both using these two sources, but imposing their own perspective on the gospel stories. And so Mark tells the story, I would say, of a misunderstood prophet, Jesus who dies really alone and forsaken. There's no resurrection stories in Mark. There's no good news really, except the empty tomb and the women running away in terror. So Mark is very short, and it's a story of action. Jesus is always doing stuff. Again, Q was probably just a collection of sayings. Luke takes some of these same stories and turns it into a story that is really has to do. Luke has a deep distrust of wealth, and he is very critical of the wealthy and the powerful. See that in Luke over and over again. Matthew is considered to be the most Jewish in perspective, probably. Matthew doesn't criticize the Jews so much as he criticizes the Jewish leadership, especially the temple leadership in Jerusalem. So you'll see that a lot. So again, they're taking some of the same stuff that they're adapting it to reflect their own concerns and the concerns of the communities in which they were telling these stories. John, probably written the last, completely different. And John places the strongest emphasis on Jesus' divinity. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus points to the kingdom of God. In John, Jesus points to himself over and over and over again, and his identity is the Son of God. It's very, very different. John, of course, has no parables at all, whereas the telling of parables is one of the most distinctive features of Jesus' ministry, as recounted by Matthew and Mark. So that's a very, very brief summary. I think it's important for us to keep in mind that these are different stories. We've kind of alluded to this earlier in talking about, maybe there's no right or wrong. Which of these stories is the most true? Well, all of them. They all report a very important perspective. There's a reason that the people who put the gospel, the Bible together as we have it today, included 4 different versions of the same story. If they all matched up exactly, they wouldn't need to do that. So I think we should be very grateful for these 4 different accounts that we have of Jesus' life and ministry. Claire, anything to add to that?
I don't think so, except enjoy chapter 17, follow me. And I think we're going to focus on the Sermon on the Mount section, as well as the beginning of Jesus' ministry, his baptism and that sort of thing. And we'll dive into parables in a second class. So from chapter 17.
So you're going to take 2 classes to do chapters. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that's a very good strategy, because this chapter covers a lot of stuff. The beginning of Jesus' ministry, his baptism, his temptation, Sermon on the Mount, and the parables. Too much to do in one class, so good deal.
Yeah. And thank y'all so much for your summaries. I thoroughly enjoyed them. And I think it was helpful to know kind of where we've been. And so thank you very much.
Hey, thank you very much for what you just did there. That was very meaningful.
Yes,
That you.
brief enough.
It's good.
Great.
Wonderful.
Okay, glad it's comprehensive.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right, and thank you, Claire. Claire's done most of the work organizing this session and the classes that are coming up. So thank you, and you're looking better, so we hope you're feeling better.
Oh yeah, I feel great. So it's just not being infectious. I will take care of y'all, I promise.
Yes, we know you will, and we are grateful for that. Thank you for keeping us all safe. All right, and we'll see y'all In
There's
church.
an author.
See how.
Thank you, Dave, everybody.
Oh. In May.